I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. Millions of blood pressure pills have been recalled because of contamination. Is there a problem with FDA oversight? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Many medications are now made abroad in countries like Brazil, Slovakia, Mexico, India, and China. How good is the FDA at monitoring manufacturing quality in such places?
Do you use mail-order pharmacy? Many people do because it can save them money. Insurance companies may require it. What happens to your prescription drugs if they have to sit in a hot mailbox and wait for hours?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, we talk with a pharmacy expert, a former FDA medical officer, and a pharma whistleblower.
First, the news.
In the People's Pharmacy Health headlines, the spreading measles epidemic has left more than 700 people sick in the U.S. Young children have been the hardest hit. Cases are also being reported elsewhere in the world, especially in Brazil, India, Madagascar, the Philippines, Ukraine, and Venezuela. Israel, France, Greece, and Georgia have also seen outbreaks. That means international travelers are likely to spread the virus around the world. The CDC is encouraging Americans traveling overseas to bring their vaccinations up to date before they leave. In 2000, some public health experts declared the U.S. measles-free. However, if the current outbreaks continue, it's likely we'll be facing more epidemics in the future.
We first heard about Chagas disease in 1973 while we were working in southern Mexico. A friend was examining people who were infected with the parasite Trypanosoma cruzi. They caught it from a so-called kissing bug that was common in rural communities. Chagas disease can cause congestive heart failure and sudden cardiac arrest if left untreated. Now, the kissing bug that carries Chagas disease has moved north. The CDC reports that it may now be found in Virginia, Maryland, Illinois, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. The kissing bug is also widely distributed throughout the southern U.S. If someone suspects he's been infected, there's a blood test that detects antibodies to the parasite. The CDC distributes antiparasitic drugs for treating the infection.
Elderberries have long had a reputation for fighting the flu. Most physicians undoubtedly have considered this just another old wives' tale, but scientists in Australia have recently clarified the mechanism. Using juice from commercially grown elderberries, they investigated the effects on human cells during the process of viral infection. The chemicals in the elderberry juice kept the virus from getting into the cells to infect them. Even more impressive, after cells had been infected, exposure to the juice kept the virus from replicating and spreading to new cells. In response to elderberry compounds, the cells released cytokines, inflammatory chemical signals that alert the immune system to the presence of a pathogen. Apparently, the protective phytochemicals are anthocyanidins, compounds that give the berries their deep purple coloration.
The Orphan Drug Act was signed into law in 1983. It was supposed to provide incentives for drug companies to develop medications for rare diseases. The assumption was that sales would be modest because so few patients would take the medicine. The FDA even had a name for such pharmaceuticals, significant drugs of limited commercial value. In recent years, however, orphan drugs have been a bonanza for pharmaceutical companies. The latest example is a little-known medicine called HP Acthar Gel. It's prescribed for a rare type of seizure disorder in babies. 2 decades ago, this drug cost around $40 a vial. The company increased the price over that time by almost 97,000%. A vial now costs close to $40,000. Whistleblowers have revealed that the company, Questcor Pharmaceuticals, paid doctors to prescribe the drug, often for unapproved uses such as rheumatoid arthritis and multiple sclerosis. As a result, Medicare reimbursements for this medication increased more than tenfold over the last several years. The Justice Department is now investigating.
Another week, another drug recall. Since last year, there have been dozens of recalls of angiotensin receptor blockers, or ARBs. These are blood pressure pills such as valsartan, irbesartan, and losartan. Last July, regulators discovered that the active pharmaceutical ingredients for these drugs had been contaminated with nitrosamines. These compounds are suspected carcinogens. Over the last 9 months, millions of pills have been pulled off pharmacy shelves. The latest recall comes from one of the largest generic drug makers, Teva. The company has announced that it's pulling 35 lots of losartan tablets. The best way to determine if your medication is on the suspect list is to contact the dispensing pharmacy. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. How do you get your medications? Do you pick them up at a pharmacy, or are they delivered to your mailbox? The FDA has very strict rules for storage and shipment of medicines. How well do mail-order pharmacies follow these guidelines?
To help us answer that question, we turn to Dr. Stephen Eckel. He's Associate Dean for Global Engagement and Interim Chair of the Division of Practice Advancement and Clinical Education at UNC Eshelman School of Pharmacy. He's also a Clinical Associate Professor.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Stephen Eckel.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Dr. Eckel, we'd like to talk about mail-order pharmacy. A lot of people are required to use a mail-order provider by their insurance that says, if you want us to pay for this medicine, you have to use our mail-order service. So can you tell us, please, what are the risks and what should we all understand when we order our medication by mail?
Well, mail order is becoming a very popular way to receive medications, just as you described. And first of all, we are utilizing sort of e-commerce as a business platform for many items these days. And so it's natural that one would expect to receive their medications through the mail or the internet because of other things that we receive there. While that seems like a convenient way to receive medications, there are some issues that are associated with it. I think the first one we need to recognize is ensuring that the medication is what it says it is. And so there is a risk of receiving falsified, substandard, counterfeit medications because you might be getting your medication from a irreputable source. But many of the mail orders that your insurance company is going to have you go towards are going to be a reputable source. So you don't have to worry about that as much. But you got to ensure that the medication is kept in a way that would not allow for any type of, let's say, degradation of it. So, for example, if it's a room controlled or a refrigerated medication, you need to make sure that it maintains that cold sort of temperature all the way to receiving it. Because if it got outside of that range, it could lose some potency. The same thing about room temperature. If it gets in place in a very hot place for a long period of time, again, you could lose some potency of it. I think the third issue that you need to worry about in this sort of spectrum is you don't have the opportunity to talk to a pharmacist face to face. And so you're missing out on the opportunity to ask questions or for them to ask questions of you that you might bring up information that's important for them to know.
Dr. Eckel, the FDA is very clear. I mean, it's a little unusual sometimes because the FDA can be a little opaque. But when it comes to temperature fluctuation, they have very clear instructions on virtually every medication that they approve. So room temperature for the Food and Drug Administration is 68 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, they recognize that when drugs are shipped, there can be what they call brief, and I quote them, excursions between 59 and 86 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's presumably a couple of hours. Well, hey, wait just 1 second. If you're shipping medicine from a distribution center in, let's say, Montana to an individual in, let's say, upstate New York, in the wintertime, those delivery vehicles may be out for hours, and the temperature could well be below freezing, not for half an hour, but basically all day long. And if you're delivering in the summer to Florida or Arizona, they may be above 100 degrees Fahrenheit for hours. And then if you stick the medicine in a mailbox at a rural route, I mean, it could sit there, again, for hours for somebody to get home. That's way beyond the FDA's temperature guidelines.
You're exactly correct. Those things could happen, and we don't know when they're going to happen. And then the other thing we don't recognize is the impact of that on the potency of the medication. Generally speaking, it's probably not a problem, but again, you don't know when the ones that are happening that you need to be concerned about. And so if we continue to grow the mail order side of the business, then I think we need to be able to put some inexpensive ways to ensure that the temperature of that product was maintained throughout the course of the delivery. One of the things that we've done many years in hospitals, very simple thing, but in a clinic where, let's say it's a refrigerator that's storing flu vaccines, and they're not open on the weekends, and there was a power interruption that happened between Friday and Monday. Well, you might not know that the power went off and the refrigerator stopped cooling the medications because it came back on by Monday. And so we actually put a little bit of, we take a cup, put some water, freeze the water, and then put a penny on the top. And if for some reason we come back on Monday and the penny's still on the top, then we know that it's maintained its freezing temperature. But if that became liquid, the ice became liquid, the penny fell to the bottom and then refroze, we could tell that there was a change in the temperature and that medication that was been stored in that refrigerator is probably not something that we want to use. And so we could develop some different ways to be able to monitor the temperature so that when that patient receives it through the mail, they can at least have surety that there has not been a significant breach. Now, you bring up, obviously, the mailbox situation, and that might be a little bit more difficult. But again, if we're going to use this, we need to be able to provide information to the patient that what they received is the right medication and it's still safe to use.
Dr. Eckel, I wonder if you can give us some examples of what might happen if a person went out to the mailbox, picked up the medication, started to use it without realizing that this medication has actually been damaged by its exposure to either extreme cold or extreme heat.
I think that probably the situations that would be most concerning would be around medications that we refer to as narrow therapeutic index, whereby the therapeutic window of effectiveness is pretty tight. And so, for example, let's say an individual has had a transplantation of some organ, and you have to put them on immunosuppressant medications so that the organ would not be rejected by the body. Well, in that situation, you need to have certain medications within a therapeutic window, and there's tight monitoring of that. And so if for some reason you are continuing that therapy, you have an optimal dose, but for some reason that medication is not at the potency as you would expect, you could create a situation whereby in that situation, you would fall outside of that therapeutic window, which could lead to some of the problems that we're talking about.
Dr. Eckel, we received a message from one of our readers. This person said, I have stage 4 metastatic breast cancer. My oncologist prescribed Ibrance shipped by UPS. I happened to be outside when the delivery truck pulled up. It was 97 degrees here in Florida with a heat index of well over 100 degrees. That's not appropriate for this medicine that I hope will save my life. I talked with CVS Specialty Pharmacy, Pfizer, the manufacturer, and the FDA. I have no interest in filing a lawsuit, but if I can't get my medication shipped safely, I will. The FDA and Pfizer both recommended I not take the pills delivered that hot day. The order was replaced. No one seems to know exactly what temperature any medication starts degrading. How can we make sure everyone gets their medications safely? Do you have an answer?
Well, I think you're bringing up an important issue because as we talked about earlier, the growth of mail order, whether it's being mandated by the insurer or not, is something that is going to continue. And so we probably need to do much more research, situations like this, to determine either if we cannot demonstrate that there is tight temperature control throughout, then we need to come up with some better policies around, are there some certain medications like this one for cancer treatment, whether they should be restricted from mail order as opposed to being required to go there because of some of the issues that you're highlighting right there. And I think we probably need to come together as an industry to further dialogue and come up with clear guidance.
Dr. Eckel, is there anything we consumers should be doing?
Well, I think, first of all, we all believe that going to the pharmacy is the best way to get your medications. Not only beyond the safety things we've talked about, but you have that opportunity to dialogue with a pharmacist to ensure that those medications are meeting your needs. There's no side effects. There's no drug interactions. And so the first thing that I always tell people is you need to have a relationship with your pharmacist because they're going to be looking out for you. And then secondarily, it's, trying to have a plan that allows you options in how you get your medications. But then thirdly, if for some reason you are receiving your medications through mail order, and if you ever have a concern or question about the integrity of it, you should feel comfortable calling up and asking for a different shipment of it. And they should be willing to give that to you because of it sat on my porch, sat in my mailbox for an extended period of time, and there was significant temperature fluctuations that day.
Dr. Stephen Eckel, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
You've been listening to Dr. Stephen Eckel, Associate Dean for Global Engagement and Interim Chair of the Division of Practice Advancement and Clinical Education at UNC Eshelman School of Pharmacy. He's a clinical associate professor. Dr. Eckel is also Associate Director of Pharmacy at UNC Hospitals.
After the break, we'll talk with a former FDA medical officer and learn what they do.
How does the push for lower prices affect the quality of your prescription drugs?
A number of blood pressure pills have been recalled over the past year because they're contaminated with carcinogens. How could that happen?
Does the FDA look at the paper trail for a medication instead of at the actual facilities making it?
Learn about safe handling and storage of medicines.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy podcast is sponsored in part by Kaya Biotics. KAYA Biotics offers the first probiotics which are both certified organic and hypoallergenic.
All probiotics are produced in Germany under laboratory conditions with high-quality ingredients and under strict regulatory oversight.
The 3 available formulas are created for very specific purposes, such as strengthening the immune system, fighting yeast infections, and helping with weight loss.
To learn more about Kaya Biotics probiotics and the important topic of gut health, you can visit their website, KayaBiotics.com. That's KAYA Biotics.com. Use the discount code PEOPLE for $10 off your first purchase. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. If you would like to purchase a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1163. That number again, 800-732-2334, or find it at peoplespharmacy.com. You can also download the free podcast from iTunes.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Verizana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome. Online at verisana.com.
We're talking about the trade-off between quality and price, especially when it comes to generic drugs. How well does the FDA monitor generic drug manufacturers both here and overseas?
Our guest is Dr. David Gortler. He's a former FDA medical officer. For 2 decades, he's worked as a pharmacology expert in the area of drug safety. He's a professor of pharmacology and biotechnology in Washington, D.C., and consults for the group formerfda.com.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. David Gortler.
Hi, thanks for reaching out.
Dr. Gortler, we noted that you are a former FDA medical officer. Could you tell us what are the responsibilities of an FDA medical officer?
Well, the responsibilities are many and complicated, but the bottom line is what we do is we review new drugs or existing drugs that want new indications, and all we do is make sure that the drugs are safe and that they do what they're intended to do. Of course, there's a lot more to it than just that.
Dr. Gortler, we've seen recently an initiative for lower prices. This mostly means generic drugs. A lot of times, these are very inexpensive generic drugs. You can get a month's supply for just $4 at some big box stores. So the question is, are there consequences of driving the cost down so much? Does it have an impact on quality?
Well, it certainly does. And it goes back to the old adage everyone's heard, you get what you pay for. And I think everybody would agree that drugs should be more affordable. But the problem is nobody's really talking about the quality of those drugs. And right now, in order to save on labor costs, a lot of pharmaceutical companies are either emerging or American pharmaceutical companies are transferring their business to these third world countries where labor costs are very low. The problem is that in those countries, the quality of the drugs aren't very good. And I think the consumers are being duped by going to pharmacies and not knowing where their drugs are coming from. I think this is something the consumer should be able to choose from. I think they should be able to decide if they're willing to take sweatshop type drugs or not.
Now, Dr. Gortler, this has all been brought home to Americans over the last 6 months or so with regard to a class of blood pressure pills called ARBs, angiotensin receptor blockers, drugs like losartan, irbesartan, and valsartan. There have been so many recalls of these drugs that we've completely lost count. It's over 15 major recalls with lots involving hundreds of products and pills, hundreds of bottles of pills. And what we've heard recently is, well, initially it was NDMA, and then it was NDEA, and now there's a third contaminant called NMBA, and they're all nitrosamines. They're all probable carcinogens. And it's like, how did that happen? And how is it still happening? And people are kind of shrugging their shoulders and going, well, how can I trust the drug companies that are selling these generic drugs to make sure my medicine isn't contaminated?
Well, unfortunately, what happened with these IRBs and ARBs, these drugs, as far as a contamination issue and a safety issue coming on, that's something which was really inevitable. And this is nowhere near the end. This is just something that we happen to have caught right now.
What we've heard is that in the case of the ARBs, the manufacturer was trying to improve yield, that is to say, make it more efficient. And they changed the manufacturing process. And apparently some of the companies may have been reusing the reagents, the chemicals that they use to make these products. And that in turn has led to the contamination with nitrosamines. I think that most Americans assume that the FDA is inspecting these plants very carefully and is really on top of the manufacturing process. You've implied in one of the articles that quoted you that the inspections involve looking over paper records or electronic records and trusting that they're real instead of actually randomly testing the medications. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, of course. So what's important to know is that when you reuse reagents or you change the process in order to try to get a higher yield, that's something which has to be applied for and approved by the FDA. Not doing that or reusing reagents or changing any process is a violation of GMP or good manufacturing processes. Now, the problem is that when it comes to inspecting drug companies, most drug companies that are going to be inspected that are located in the United States are going to be or Canada are inspected approximately once every 24 months. In the facilities overseas, it becomes a little bit more complicated. When you have an FDA inspector travel overseas, they have to, there's a process they have to go through with our State Department and the host country's State Department. And sometimes it can take months. For example, India is a democracy, which is great, but like they're an early democracy, and early democracies tend to be corrupt, as can be seen. So because of the corruption issues, when an application goes through to our State Department to India's State Department, sometimes somebody is tipped off. And because of the delay, it gives these drug companies time to clean up their act. Because of this delay, overseas drug facilities are only inspected approximately once to every 5 to 7 years. There can also be a language barrier, and there can be a lot of the times the people who are producing these drugs don't really know what they're producing. They're general engineers. And that's one of the things that these companies do to keep the prices of drugs down. It's very, very upsetting to people like myself who've dedicated their lives as a pharmacist and a pharmacologist to people taking safe drugs that should work.
One of the things that Americans love are lower prices. And there have been a lot of calls to lower the cost of prescription drug medications. The problem, of course, is that the prices have gone into the stratosphere. I mean, it's not unusual to see the cost of cancer drugs in the six figures and higher over a course of a lifetime. But we also love generic drugs. Insurance companies love them, hospitals love them, and patients love them because they can get medicines at a much, much lower cost. How many of our drugs are now generic, and how many of them are coming from overseas?
Well, approximately, I think it's somewhere around 80% of our generic drugs right now are coming from overseas. And the problem is, of course, the only problem is with having lower prices is I believe, and as we've seen historically with reports, are lower quality. One of the things Elizabeth Warren has brought to the forefront is wanting to bring all drug manufacturing back to the United States, which is a good idea. Of course, we don't know how much that would cost, but the idea fundamentally is a very good one. And I know everybody likes to save money on their drugs, and I'm figuratively slamming my desk over here. You have to talk about quality. You can't just talk about price when it comes to pharmaceuticals. Certain things you can. Certain things are generally interchangeable if you just want to buy them for the cheapest price possible. Like a pair of gym socks, what could really be the difference between one pair and the other than the material of which they're made? And of course, some people are very specific about where they buy very certain items, but they sort of see drugs as a fungible product, which of course they aren't. But there's no way that one could actually know that by looking at the pill in the palm of their hand, because nobody's doing the quality control of testing these drugs. People think that's the FDA's job, but really it isn't. What happens is when the FDA goes in for an inspection, they'll look at electronic records or handwritten records or whatever they'll look at, and they'll trust the company when they say that one of their drugs is, we tested this batch and we found it to be within an order of magnitude. It's a 97 point whatever % pure, but anybody can write anything on a piece of paper. Anyone can enter data into an electronic record and say, yes, this is 97%. Nobody is looking over the shoulder of these drug companies, whether they're in the United States or it's overseas. And that's where my frustration comes from, because it destroys the entire continuum of trying to treat patients. These drugs are approved, the pharmacies dispense them, the insurance companies pay for them, the patients take it home, they're compliant with taking it every day. And in the very end, these drugs, which everybody goes through all the efforts to dispense and have paid for by insurance companies, are inherently subpar and ineffective, or in some cases, like the valsartan, even toxic.
Dr. Gortler, do you have any advice for our listeners?
Well, this is something which the state boards of pharmacies really haven't taken a lot of time to address. And of course, you can't really blame the pharmacists either, because the pharmacists are just looking at the bottles and they're taking it for granted that if something says 100 milligrams of metoprolol or whatever, that there's 100 milligrams in there. At this point, I think action is required. Either people should be knowledgeable about where their drugs come from on the pharmacy label, or I think there needs to be some sort of double check on these drugs that are being sent to our consumers. I think a laboratory since the FDA is not doing their job of actually proactively testing these drugs, which is a shame because they're supposed to be protecting us. I believe a third party has to step in and do this for them. This is something which needs to be addressed now. It should have been addressed nearly a decade ago. Everyone should be throwing their attention at this matter. Of course, I'm a little biased. I've dedicated my life to the safety of drugs. Since my background is pharmacology and pharmacy, I think it's the most important. It's an existential issue which threatens the American population.
Dr. Gortler, I recognize that the issue of drug quality is very complicated, and where they're made and under what conditions is really important. But there's one other aspect to this, and it has to do with what I would call storage and shipping or handling. And if you look on the prescription information, the official prescribing information for all medications, they come with very clear FDA guidelines about what the temperature fluctuation can be for shipping these medications short-term and the long-term handling of them, and then how both the pharmacy and the consumer should store them either in the store or at home. And what fascinates us is that, these guidelines from the FDA are actually not implemented as far as we can tell. I mean, for the most part, the FDA has no jurisdiction over how the pills are shipped from abroad to this country, or what happens once they arrive here, how long they stay in the port of entry, and then finally, how they get from the port of entry to the pharmacy distribution centers, and how they get from the distribution centers to a local pharmacy. That's state-by-state board of pharmacy kind of thing. How important is storage and handling when it comes to quality?
The storage of drugs at the correct temperature is absolutely, fundamentally critical. And so what the FDA considers to be room temperature is between 68 and 78 degrees Fahrenheit. The storage of drugs is probably second only to the quality of drugs as far as importance goes, and one of the things that I focus on. So when the problem arises too is not only if the drugs are not meeting quality controls to begin with, but whether they're being stored properly. This is a problem which needs to be addressed by mail order houses. Most of the drugs dispensed in the United States now come from mail order facilities. And those mail order facilities, the vast majority of them are located in the state of Arizona, where everyone knows Arizona is a desert and it's exceedingly hot over here. Humana has a mail order pharmacy in Glendale, Arizona. Walgreens has a mail order pharmacy in Tempe, Arizona. PillPack, which is owned by Amazon, is in Phoenix, Arizona. And Express Scripts, which is the largest mail order house in America, is located in Tempe, Arizona. I think United Health also has a facility in Arizona as well. Unfortunately, the FDA gives recommendations for what room temperatures are, but the Arizona State Board of Pharmacy and the Attorney General has turned a complete blind eye to this. I'm not sure what their focus is, but for me, the storage of drugs is the most critical. Now, most people just see a white tablet or capsule in their hand, and just because it is an ice cream and it doesn't melt doesn't mean that it isn't affected by adverse temperatures. They absolutely are. in Arizona, when it does get hot, now if you want to exceed these temperatures just a little bit in some other states, perhaps it's not that big of a deal to go from 68 to 78 degrees, and maybe you hit 85 for like a little while, maybe it's okay. But when you get your drugs from mail order pharmacies, of course, because these are publicly traded entities, you will be getting the cheapest available drugs that will be coming from the aforementioned countries with poor quality control, the third world countries. But on top of that, these drugs will not be mailed express, and these drugs will be mailed by ground in UPS trucks, and they'll be stored in a facility before they're mailed in a facility which is not going to be refrigerated. And when you exceed the temperatures, perhaps it's okay, if you're just transporting a drug from your car to your home. But when you receive a drug a week later that's been sitting in the back of a UPS truck in Arizona, where the temperatures routinely exceed 110 degrees and even 120 degrees, in the back of a UPS truck, it's not uncommon for the temperature to exceed 150 degrees. It sort of feels like in Arizona, I grew up in Arizona, of course, and whenever you bake cookies and you open up the oven to see how they're doing, and you kind of get that whoosh in your face of that hot air coming out of the oven. In Arizona, you get that just opening the front door of your house. And even when it's hot outside, you sort of get that whoosh of hot air when you open up your car door. And these are the conditions under which these drugs are being stored. And the State Board of Pharmacy of Arizona doesn't seem to care. One can think that a lot of these state boards, and this is a problem which is endemic all over the United States, are infiltrated with pharmacists from chain pharmacies or executives. And so when these issues come up, they, of course, are going to say things that are going to favor their employer and kind of just brush the issue away. But the storage of drugs are absolutely critical. And that's something which is also being ignored. And again, people could be taking these drugs. They could be taking their birth control pills. They could be taking their drugs for their diabetes, for their cholesterol. And there's no way of knowing if these drugs are going to be working, especially if they're stored inappropriately. I would say that they're more than likely, if these drugs are not stored correctly or not produced correctly, they're more than likely not to be effective. And in the worst case scenarios, some of these drugs can even mutate in the presence of water or high temperatures into a poison. We don't see that very often, but we do know it's the case with doxycycline and a few other drugs. So absolutely, this is something which is key, and absolutely, it's critical.
Dr. David Gortler, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you for reaching out.
You've been listening to Dr. David Gortler, former FDA medical officer and professor of pharmacology and biotechnology. He consults for the group formerfda.com.
After the break, a whistleblower will describe why his former company was fined $500 million.
What did they do wrong to justify that penalty?
Generic drug malfeasance isn't limited to one company or even one country.
How can we assure data integrity and drug quality?
Find out what we should do so that we can trust our prescription medications.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
This People's Pharmacy podcast is brought to you in part by Verisana.com.
Verisana Lab offers home health tests that allow you to monitor your hormones and health conditions. You can take control of the quantitative assessment of your health and learn about male and female hormone balance, the stress hormone cortisol, leaky gut, gluten intolerance, or your gut microbiome.
Take a more active role in tracking your health and take 20% off your first order of a mail-in testing opportunity with the discount code PEOPLE. That's uppercase PEOPLE. To learn more, go to Verisana.com. That's Verisana.com. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. If you would like to purchase a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy episode, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1163. The number again, 800-732-2334, or you can place the order at peoplespharmacy.com. You could also download the free podcast from iTunes or from our web store. We invite you to consider writing a review.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Kaya Biotics, probiotic products made in Germany from certified organic ingredients. That's Kaya Biotics.com.
It isn't easy for the FDA to keep tabs on generic drug makers in other countries. What are the obstacles, and what could be done to overcome them? Both patients and doctors might need to pay more attention to where our prescription medicines are coming from.
Our guest is Dinesh Thakur. He worked previously in the pharmaceutical industry overseeing drug development. After blowing the whistle on his former employer, Ranbaxy, he's become a public health activist focused on improving the quality of affordable medicines around the globe.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dinesh Thakur.
Thank you, Terry. Been a long-time listener to your program, so this is indeed a pleasure to be able to speak with you.
Dinesh, it is a real honor for us to speak with you. You are a whistleblower. You have accomplished some extraordinary things when it comes to pharmaceutical overview. Perhaps you can tell our listeners a little bit about your experience with the pharmaceutical industry.
So I'm a chemical engineer by training. I went to the University of New Hampshire, got a master's degree there, and I worked at Bristol Myers Squibb, a large pharmaceutical company, for about 11 years. And then I had an opportunity to go work in India, where I'm from, in 2003. And then that's how I got sort of involved in understanding how the generic drug industry works. I worked in the industry in India for just about 18 months. And then, one thing led to another. Then I, sort of did things on my own. And I think what I told the FDA back in 2005 became public in 2013 when the company that I went to work for pled guilty to 7 counts of criminal felony and agreed to pay $500 million in fines to the U.S. government.
Hold on a sec. How much did you say? $500 million?
Yeah, it was $500 million in all. I was the largest of any penalties that was assessed on a member of the generic drug industry by the U.S. government until that time.
So they pleaded guilty to a number of counts, and they paid $500 million in fines. What did they do wrong? You basically were actively involved in revealing some of those problems.
So like any other investigation, right, there were a series of set of things that I thought they were doing wrong, which essentially I talked to the FDA, told the FDA about. But then, what the company pled to and essentially sort of agreed that they were doing wrong were to sell substandard medicines in the U.S. market. They copped a plea to 7 counts of criminal felony, saying that, and the settlement agreement lists out what drugs that there were and, how much, so what kind of, substandard medicine that they were actually selling in the U.S. market. So that's what they agreed to plead. But in my experience, the wrongdoing was a lot more pervasive than that.
Well, it's not just Ranbaxy, although you were the whistleblower with the company that you were working for. There have been a lot of companies, not just in India, but in China and other places around the world,
including the U.S.
and in the United States itself, where the generic manufacturer got into trouble with the Food and Drug Administration. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I think that, what came to the surface as a part of what happened at Ranbaxy opened the door for a new sort of area of compliance, which is commonly known in the industry parlance as data integrity. See, I think in the United States, the FDA has done such a wonderful job of convincing us that if a manufacturer gets an approval, then the generic formulation that is much cheaper than what the patented formulation is bioequivalent, meaning that it works exactly the same way that the patented formulation should work in. And for a long time, when we had our ability to control and oversee and enforce quality, where manufacturing was primarily within the United States, the FDA did a wonderful job of doing that because, they had the ability to show up at your door unannounced, ask you to show how you made it, verify that you're doing what you said that you would do. But those things don't necessarily work the way they ought to work when the manufacturing facility is half the world away.
And can you just spell out for us why it makes a difference whether the inspection is unanticipated or whether somebody is all ready for you to come and inspect if you're an FDA inspector?
So for a long period of time, the way it worked is that when you get an approval from the FDA, when you go to the FDA and say, this is the medicine that I think I can make, I've done clinical studies on it, I know that it works, I have tested it in the lab, I've tested it on patients, I find that the risk of taking this medicine is smaller than the benefit that it would deliver, the FDA would then ask you, well, how are you going to make it? What is the recipe for you to make it, in large quantities, right? It's one thing to make a pot of chili for dinner for 2 people, but if you have to cook that for 100 people who are coming for dinner at a large gathering, it requires a certain amount of process around it. And so what companies would have to do is tell the FDA, this is the way that we would make it if we were to make, a batch of 100,000 pills, right? And the FDA would then, say, this makes sense, and these are the controls that we would exercise. But because the way things were set up in the US, the FDA doesn't actually test the final product. It works on an honor system saying that you said that this is what you would do. Periodically, we will come to your facility. Periodically, we'll come to your kitchen to make sure that you're using the right amount of salt, right amount of tomatoes in making your chili, to make sure that you have consistency in taste, in the texture, in the way that you serve, right?
Right, and that you're not putting anything that shouldn't go in, and that you are washing your dishes in between, right?
Exactly. And so that process worked on an honor system when we had facilities within, our area of control, that we could just show up at their door and say, open up the door, we want to see how clean your kitchen is. Do you, as you said, do you clean your dishes, between making 2 different batches of chili, right? Do you wear hairnets to make sure that you don't have hair falling into the cooking pot? You could do that when the facility was in Ohio, in Puerto Rico, in upstate New York. Well, if the facility is located in, Nashik, India, it's not that easy to do, right? So you'll have to send your inspectors on a flight. Well, they can't enter a country without a visa, right? So you'll have to get a visa to these people. Until 2013, the way that you got a visa is that the company would actually request a visa of the Indian embassy located in Washington, D.C. or in New York and say, these inspectors who are coming in to inspect the facility, can you give them a visa? Guess what? I mean, if you know that you're getting them a visa, you know where they're coming, right? So imagine if you're running a kitchen and then when the food inspector is going to show up, are you going to try and not make sure that everything is spick and span before they show up?
Of course you are.
And that's exactly what happens. So if you tell them ahead of time that and these inspectors, remember, they are traveling halfway across the globe. And they're there for 3-4 days. I mean, I don't know how often you travel overseas, but if you travel to India like I do all the time, the first couple of days I'm jet lagged. I'm not as functional as I am here, right? And same thing happens to me when I come back. It takes me a couple of days to get back on my feet. So if you're there for, let's say, a week, you land there, you're halfway across the globe. When it's day over there, it's night over here. Your body takes time to get adjusted. And then you don't know the language. You don't know the layout of the place. So you're relying on the company to chaperone you, to take you wherever you need to go to do what you need to do. How effectively do you think you're going to be at that point in time?
It sounds as if it could be a stage-managed process. I believe those were your precise words. And it's a snapshot in time. Once the inspectors leave, 6 months later, things could be quite different.
Precisely. And so, if on a certain date, you have these people show up, you'll make sure that everything is spick and span, clean, everything is, done by the book. And then, once people leave, guess what? you go back to doing the same old, what you needed to do to try and get the product out the door. And I think that what has happened in the last 4 or 5 years is that there are some FDA inspectors who have become very, very good at spotting discrepancies between what is said and what is actually represented. I mean, I can talk about one that I know of, who I respect a lot, Peter Baker, when he was based in the Delhi office of the US FDA. He did some amazing work. I mean, to the extent that it essentially became forensic inspections in understanding what the company and the management was telling you and what you would actually see on the factory floor when you went to inspect, right? But that takes a lot of time and a lot of experience to try and get to that point.
Dinesh, what do you recommend for consumers? Because what we've been talking about is quality. Sometimes for life-saving medications, if you've had an organ transplant, for example, and you have to take an immune-modulating drug that's going to help prevent your body from rejecting that organ, there's no room for error. If you have a heart condition and the medicine that you take to keep your heart regular or under control, again, no room for error. Blood thinners, no room for error. And yet we've had conditions where heparin is, for example, a blood thinner, was a real problem made in China. So what can consumers and patients do to be able to protect themselves from these concerns that you have raised about quality standards and quality control and the FDA's oversight?
So I wish there was a simple answer I could give you, Joe. I don't have a simple answer. I think that there are 3 different things that I think that, at least that I'm focused on. The first is education. I think that the discussion in our country right now is primarily focused on price. We are so focused on price, and for good reason. I think that there are a lot of medicines that are out of reach of people who really need that. But I think that the discussion also needs to include an element of quality. I mean, what good is it if you end up buying a cheap medicine that doesn't work, right?
Exactly. You've just wasted the little bit of money you were spending.
You had. Exactly.
And you may have a terrible outcome.
And possibly put your health at risk.
Precisely. And so I think that there is some, we need to broaden this discussion a little bit. I think price is important, but I think quality is equally important. And I think that we need to educate ourselves a little better. The second thing that I think that we need to do is, I think that we need to look at a regulatory framework. I think that what the FDA was set up for and how they helped sort of ensure quality worked extremely well when we could control our manufacturing within the continental United States. Whether we like it or not, globalization is here to stay. We are going to source medicines that are made in overseas. I think that we really need to think carefully about the model that the FDA is employing at the moment in the way that they are actually ensuring quality of our drug supply, right? This honor system that we sort of, relied on for a very long period of time, is that the right model? Because the facts have changed. From the consumer point of view, I think what's important is that every time you go to get your prescription filled, whether it's CVS or Walgreens or Rite Aid, look carefully at the manufacturer's name. It's on in the package insert, the piece of paper they give you along with the bottle. It tells you, who the manufacturer is. And take a moment to go on Google and check them out and find out how many recalls have they had, what kind of regulatory actions they've had, right? With that information, I think that you can go back to your doctor and say, I'm concerned about this. Or, if you feel that there is a problem with the medication that you're taking, it's not working the way it's supposed to work, your blood pressure's not, coming down, you don't feel the way you ought to feel, at least you have a piece of data that you can take back. I mean, physicians like Harry Lever, and I'm sure you've spoken to him, has been a great advocate in educating even the medical fraternity, to this aspect of it, because most physicians don't even pay attention to this, right? So if you have the data, you can at least have a conversation with your doctor. Maybe they're able to get you a different formulary, the one that doesn't have the kind of issues that we are dealing with. So I think these are 3 things that I can think of. I wish there was a simple answer. I just don't know what. I think it's going to take some time for us to resolve this issue.
Dinesh, if you go to buy a shirt, or if you go to the grocery store and buy an apple, they have the country of origin on them.
Correct.
You will know exactly where that shirt or that apple came from We can't do the same thing very easily with our medications. Should we have country of origin labeling?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the first thing that we need to have is on that package insert, in addition to the name of the manufacturer, we need to know what facility made this.
Dinesh, in summing up your work and research over the last decade or two, it seems to me that the focus here in the United States in particular is mostly about price. And we keep hearing over and over again how great the Food and Drug Administration is about saving Americans money on generic drugs. There's not a lot of discussion regarding quality. Basically, the FDA says, hey, our drugs are the safest, the best in the world. Don't worry, be happy. Let's save money. What would you like to tell the commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration if you had his ear?
I think, a lot of what somebody like me would actually say is to go back and have the FDA look at their own data, right? I mean, thankfully, FDA is one of the agencies that actually is reasonably transparent. They put out this FDA dashboard that tells us how many inspections they undertook, what they found, what are they doing differently. I think that they've had 5 years worth of data now of the model that they're currently employing in ensuring the quality of the medicine supply for our country. The question that I would ask the FDA commissioner is, given this data, given that you see repeated violations of a similar nature of the same manufacturers, what is it that you're going to do differently to ensure that the quality of our drug supply continues to be the same as it has been for the rest of the FDA's history until about 5 years ago?
Dinesh Thakur, thank you very much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Joe. It's a pleasure, as always.
You've been listening to Dinesh Thakur, a public health activist working to improve the quality of affordable medicines across the globe. As a whistleblower, he was responsible for the prosecution of Ranbaxy Laboratories for supplying adulterated drugs to the U.S. market. In 2013, the company pled guilty to criminal felonies in the U.S. court and paid $500 million in fines. Mr. Thakur now focuses on the need for data integrity in pharmaceutical manufacturing.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wadarsky engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Verizana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome. Online at verisana.com.
To buy a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1163. That number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com.
And when you visit our site, you can share your thoughts about today's show. Have you had any experiences that led you to question the quality of your prescription drugs?
At peoplespharmacy.com, you can sign up for our free online newsletter or subscribe to the free podcast of the show. You'll never miss another episode, and you can share it with a friend.
When you sign up for the newsletter, you'll get our free e-guide to favorite home remedies.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thanks for listening. Please join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.